So the second quarter report I'm here today to present includes unaudited financial activity, in this case through June 30th of 2020. The second quarter report is useful because it comes out right after we adopt the revised budget. So we're going to use it to give you some feedback on trends that relate to what you just discussed over the last couple of months when you revised the budget. We can also use it to look at our activity 1 year ago through the second quarter. Now, this second quarter report is particularly relevant because, as you know, we spent the last 3.5 months talking about budget revisions that would likely be necessary due to the COVID-19 virus. So I'll focus most of the presentation reminding you what we did in the budget process and giving you some feedback on how we're trending relative to what we talked about over the last couple of months. So the good news is that the general fund is actually performing relatively close to what we had expected throughout the last 3 months as we revised the budget, which is really kind of remarkable. But that means that all our estimating and all our presentations that we provided and all our guidance that we provided and the budget that you adopted is, at this point, relatively on track. Now, the Gulf Fund does continue to deteriorate. That's a long-standing issue that we've brought up every quarter. This quarter, I also want to talk about transit and airport. Typically, we don't talk about those two enterprise funds, but they have had some decreased revenues due to the impact of COVID. Now, in both of those cases, we have federal funds that generally should offset any negative impact of those decreased revenues. So let's talk about the general fund revenues. Again, we revised the budget down approximately $13 million as part of the revised budget process. We talked about how we expected weakness in sales tax and interest earnings and charges for services and court fines and a few other areas. What I would tell you today is, again, in general, in aggregate, most of our revenues are performing similarly to what we expected. Some are underperforming a little bit, some are overperforming. I'll point out too, sales tax is actually overperforming compared to what we expected, and that's a very good trend. Now, we'll get into later whether that's due to the unemployment stimulus or other things, whether that trend will continue, and we monitor that closely. But the fact of the matter is that's encouraging that our sales tax revenues are actually overperforming. On the negative side, our charges for services are underperforming. I don't know that that's unexpected because, again, a lot of those are activity-based, and a lot of our activities as this situation has gone on have been curtailed. So we are seeing some weakness there. Let's flip to the expenditure side. Again, we revised down expenditures roughly $12 million. Again, overall, expenditures are generally performing about where we expected. We're seeing reduced expenditures actually in some areas, and those are typically areas where we have reduced activity, which would be, again, the park department, the city manager's office, particularly on the cultural services side, and municipal court. Probably the only area where we're seeing some challenges on the expenditure side would be expected, and that is in the police department. And that's primarily due to some overtime expenditures that they incurred in June that were significantly higher than what we would have expected. So just a quick look at where we're trending this year through the second quarter compared to last year through the second quarter. And you can see down at the bottom, our net margin is virtually identical, which is, again, encouraging. You can also see, as far as order of magnitude, you can see that our growth is very, very slight, again, not unexpectedly. But the takeaway from this slide is we're generally performing relatively consistent with last year. So again, takeaways, we're doing about as we presented over the last couple months. Sales tax is outperforming, police expenditures are over budget, but those are the two outliers. I should point out also that the CARES Act funding is going to be very important for us. It's not really reflected in the second quarter report, but just looking ahead, that's going to be very important for where we end the year up as far as how many expenditures we have relative to the CARES Act funding and our reimbursements that we receive. I'll touch on that one more time before we end our discussion today. Let's touch on the Gulf Fund. You've seen a slide very similar to this many times, so I'll be brief, but Gulf rounds were down in the second quarter about 24%. Now, we did have fewer courses this year than we had last year, so that's a portion of that, but a lot of that was due to the course closures and other things. Revenues are down 31%. Expenditures were also down somewhat commensurately in the second quarter. But the bottom line is the Gulf Fund still has an unencumbered net position at the end of the second quarter of a negative $238,000. Mentioned these briefly earlier. Operating revenues in transit are down. Ridership was down. in the first and second quarter. Again, expenditures were also down, although not to the same degree. But again, transit has some federal grants available to them, particularly on the capital side, which should mitigate most of the impact, I think, or at least some of the impact. Airport, same story. Their revenues are down, but again, there's federal revenues that are flowing to the airport that will assist them. We'll touch on our debt levels briefly. We typically show you this graphic right here. This shows you our total debt portfolio, which is about $1.027 billion or thereabouts. About half of our debt portfolio is revenue bond debt, which is primarily water and sewer utility, and the other half or so is general obligation debt. The takeaway on this slide is the dark blue slice there is general obligation at large debt. That's the debt paid back with property taxes, probably the most relevant to most taxpayers. That debt is about 6% of our total portfolio, about 6%. Totals about $65 million. I would also tell you that we're about $900 million below the state debt limit. That is to say, we're using about 30% of our state debt limit, so tremendous amount of capacity there. Just looking forward a little bit, we will issue some additional debt here in a couple of weeks, but we also have fairly significant principal payments towards the end of the year. So I would expect when we present the fourth quarter report here in about 6 months to tell you that our debt levels at the end of 2020 will be very similar to where we started the year, which again is just north of $1 billion. So looking forward, when we presented the material to you during the retreats and the workshops, we presented some timelines of some of the revenues that we monitor and when certain events occur. One of those was sales tax, and we indicated that we monitor sales tax monthly, which we continue to do. But the next big revenue stream that we'll be curious about will be in December, and that is when we will get our largest motor vehicle tax distribution of the year, and we'll also get property tax delinquency payments. So we'll be interested to see how those are impacted by the economic conditions at that time. We'll continue to monitor expenditures. Again, that's going to be very, very important. Again, most of our trends are favorable, but we will continue to keep a close eye on that to make sure that nothing happens that is unexpected. And again, CARES Act funding is going to be very important to us. We're working closely with our partners over at the county, and we're encouraged by some of the initial discussions we have, and we think that we will receive a pretty favorable amount of funding, which should offset most of our costs. But I just point that out, and that's something that we'll continue to monitor and something that we'll report back on certainly in the third quarter and no doubt probably in the fourth quarter report as well. So in summary, our results, particularly in the general fund, are largely as we had anticipated and what we presented to you over the last several months. With that, one other thing I wanted to mention, which I did not put on the slide here. Last 3 months ago during the quarterly presentation, we had a question about the minority spend report that we typically include in the quarterly report. We had some data collection issues, which I think Sean mentioned to you at the time. I'm happy to tell you that we have corrected most of those data collection issues. So the minority spend report actually is in this quarterly report. It's on page 72, and I'll summarize it briefly. Our spend in the second quarter was about 21%. That's elevated from last year through the second quarter, which was about 13.8%. Most of that was due to a couple of large arterial construction projects that were done by one of our minority contractors. So that explains most of the discrepancy there, or the increase. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And recommended action is to receive and file the second quarter financial report.